The reason why we are different from many of the developed economies is the huge share of informal sector we have in circular economy. And that makes the situation not so easy to handle. Well, formalization of the informal sector is not also a great idea. That how do we then strike partnership between the formal and the informal sector, and how do we get safe working conditions for the informal sector?
Hi everyone, welcome to the first edition of Bending the Lines, a circular lens of industries. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Shashwat Gangwal and I'm the founder of InfinityBox. It is my earnest request to all of you to tune in and spread the word. Because after all the pandemics and the wars end, one war which we will always be fighting for is the one for our planet and for our future generation.
Dr. Prasad Modak is an alumnus of the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. In 1995, he set up the Environmental Management Center and has been a corporate environmental consultant for financial institutions and development agencies across the country. Dr. Modak has worked with almost all key United Nations institutions in the world. Prominent amongst these are UNEP, UNDP, and most recently the Asian Development Bank. He also is an established author and has multiple books and columns to his credit. He has received a number of awards and recognitions, and his name has been listed in the Distinguished Personalities on Environmental Management. In this episode of Bending the Lines, we discuss the vital role of regulatory bodies like FICCI, Bombay Chambers of Commerce, etc. in implementing sustainability practices across India. Mr. Prasad has been leading the circular economy revolution since 1990. And in this episode, we talk about his experience of circular practices in other countries and what he has been able to achieve while being at the helm of various organizations. We also discuss what we can learn in India from those examples and what can be actually implemented on the ground. The most interesting thing is we discuss how he has helped the Indian government in drafting the plan to move towards the circular economy here in our own nation. With a rich blend of experience in academia, private sector, developmental agencies, and the government, Dr. Modak is the go-to person in the field of environmental management.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Prasad. It's an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Pleasure mine too.
Great. So today is a slightly different podcast than the other ones that I've been conducting because it's more of the role of the regulatory body in India, which is a very interesting topic, right? And how the government and the private sector are coming together to move towards a more sustainable space. So that is something that I think I would love to discuss with you, given your extensive experience in the field. And maybe the first question that I would ask is the comparison of like how India is fared as compared to other countries, because you see several other countries have not only embraced the concept of circular economy in their daily lives, but they've also brought in regulations, right, to ensure higher compliance, promote more reuse, refurbishment, and recycling. But we know that India did put out a blanket ban on single-use plastic across several categories. We expect to be single-use plastic free by 2022. But do you think that there could be like these discussions end up staying at just a discussion level, and like we falter on the implementation bit? Maybe it's because of the size of the country or the diverse areas that we're dealing with, or do you think we are on a path to achieve our goals with the current implementation plans as well?
Right. So when it comes to putting these discussions or taking them forward into practice, actually, I must say there are numerous examples already in place where people have done a bit on circularity. Because if you dissected circularity, we normally do that over something like 12 R's, we call, right? From refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, all the way to remanufacturing. And industry has been actually practicing many of these R's in different blends, without any push coming from regulations. And the real push there is they see their economic advantage. They also see that some of these practices are giving them a market advantage in some kind of a branding, In some cases, that they're finding that these practices are leading to innovations, and innovation is a big capital when it comes to the business, and circular economy promises a lot there in that space of innovations. And there therefore you see that in terms of implementation things are happening, but what we are looking at is these implementation experiences have to be assessed and upscaled and replicated at all the scales. And that's where the government comes in. And that's where I would say not just the policies which enshrine the principles and strategies, but we also need then investments coming basically on common infrastructure to promote circularity. For example, India has gone through a long experience on building common environmental infrastructures, like the common effluent treatment plants you already know about, or the common haz waste
Yeah.
between disposal facilities. But now is the time where we need common infrastructure for circularity. Now, that means that we have common infrastructure for recycling metals from electronic waste as one illustration, and we need there a push coming from various fiscal budgets where we talk about blending concessional finance with the entry coming from the private investors, and that's something which I would say is important. But one very important point I would like to add here to our discussion is that the reason why we are different from many of the developed economies is the huge share of informal sector we have in circular economy, and that makes the situation not so easy to handle. Well, formalization of the informal sector is not also a great idea. That how do we then strike partnership between the formal and the informal sector, and how do we get safe working conditions for the informal sector? Because many a times when we are talking about the end of the life situation of turning the waste materials back again into the pool of resources, the informal sector is playing a huge role, and that sector is under risk because the working conditions are not always that safe. So that's how I will put then the four important players here, not just the private sector, but also the government to push lay down the canvas for scaling up, investors who look at this as a good opportunity for investment to promote innovations, and I would add there the fourth dimension of the informal sector, which is equally important.
Right, that's quite insightful, right? And I could not agree with you more. And I think it needs to be about the informal sector, right? And I think it needs to be brought out more and more explicitly so that people started realizing that there is a huge difference in how India operates versus how USA operates, and which is something that needs to be thought about and drafted into while making the plans. And it's amazing to see that you are already doing that, and I hope that we do something about it, right? We're able to strike those partnerships that you're talking about. So one of the things that we just spoke about, right, which I could not agree with you more, is the economic opportunity, the innovations, that etc., that would come up because of circular economy and investments in circular economy. And right, Amitabh Kant, the CEO of Niti Aayog, said that circular economy has the potential to generate 1.4 crore jobs in the next 5 to 7 years and create lakhs of new entrepreneurs. So resource circularity is the need of the hour to implement circular economy. So what are your thoughts on the same?
The point made by Niti Aayog, in fact, we had an opportunity, I did some work for my company with Niti Aayog to prepare a national action plan on circular economy. And when we did that, we consulted with nine line ministries. And many of these ministries, actually, if you look at it, are connected to huge employment. When we talk about mining and the steel sector and the urban sector, industrial production sector, we are talking about really huge employment related needs as well as opportunities. Now, one thing is sure that studies made in other countries on green jobs, as a term what is used, is showing a promise that circularity is opening up additional avenues, a new kinds of business opportunities, which is giving a case, making a strong case for new business models. I mean, if you look at even the shift which is happening today from products to services, and the role of aggregators coming in into connecting the waste generators and the people who are waste recyclers. That itself is a huge area. I would even add when it came to the subject of innovations that we are not just now talking about innovations in product making, but I think the subject which we briefly touched upon when we were talking earlier is packaging. That how do you move more towards sustainable packaging, and there it means that we are trying to close the loop or changing the kinds of the matrix of materials that we would be using, which inherently reduces depletion and the GHG emission generation, but at the same time creates completely new opportunities.
Right. I could not agree with you more. Yeah, again, maybe I'm a bit more biased because my startup InfinityBox is in the sustainable packaging space. We are trying to tackle a problem which is 36,000 tons of single-use plastic waste on an annual basis. So I understand the scale of the problem, but the issue that I have is twofold, right? So not a lot of people understand it or know about it. And the second thing is, despite the fact that we keep talking about new business opportunities and avenues coming up, and that there are some movements, do you think we are still slow as a country in moving towards that?
If you really start getting into more and more details of circularity, you will find that many of the things what we're talking about were already part of our traditions. And many times you realize then what we are talking about taking corrective and preventive measures were already in place as a part of our culture. When we talk about even the first R of refuse of circular economy, it's how do you live a lean life? And that is something which was already being talked about 1,000 years ago, and even more recently so by people like Mahatma Gandhi in terms of simplicity, and then talking about not going for the greed, but so much limiting our requirements for the basic needs. So I would say that the true driver to circular economy is the citizen. It is the people, and the people, when they are oriented or reoriented, so to say, to what we used to do, which was a part of our traditional wisdom, then it would mean that the change in our consumption patterns, the way we are consuming, will drive the production and the policies which are underlying the other side. And that's how I think the important role is, how do you recommunicate circularity in simpler terms, banking on and taking people back to our traditions? And how do people then collectively start showing their preferences on certain types of products and services, and they live life which is less impacting across the life cycle? I think that's the key. So I would say, taking your point, it's very important that we have a very strong communication drive to people, and let us not be jargonistic. Let us try to use as simpler terms as we can, and take people back to the understanding of the traditions they used to follow earlier.
Right, right. I completely agree. And to your point about communication, right? So FICCI is doing a lot in making people aware about circular economy. So one of the things that I read about was the circular economy symposiums, where several industry giants are coming, which I think is a great way to not only make the industry giants aware, but also help this information percolate down to the layman. So, could you give us some more information about this? Because I think that will be incredibly helpful to understand the steps that we are actively taking, that one of the important bodies of our country is actively taking to help us move towards a more circular future.
Right. So you have to look at communication to take place at different levels, right? Chamber of Commerce's like FICCI's and I mentioned earlier BCCI's or MCCI, CII, they are actually holding many of the annual meets and roundtables where they connecting with the industries, both manufacturing sector and service sector. But often it happens that we are talking there on again and again to those who are converted already. You also need to build capacities and understanding of the professionals and students included, and that's something where a lot is to be done. For example, introducing circular economy curricula in our postgraduate courses is one possibility. Now, I've been organizing summer and winter schools on circular economy. In fact, the summer school this year will be happening in IIT Bombay after we are out of the COVID-19 threat. And the third important is that we'll have to take this message through community based organizations where we will have to do a community outreach both in the urban and semi urban settings where the consumption patterns are rising. I think that's where we, I would say, in the structure, haven't done really much in terms of taking forward these messages in terms of campaigns. Although you do see some traction now happening, towards that third tier.
Right. So I completely agree that there is a lot that needs to be done in this space to help spread awareness, and I think that is what I was trying to get to, right? So these symposiums, which FICCI conducts, are sort of restricted to industrial conglomerates, right? So I'm sort of talking about the other side of the coin, that we're not involving startups, schools, or universities to the extent that we should be, right? So at the end of the day, big conglomerates do have to do that 2% CSR, but what about ensuring or helping entrepreneurs understand the importance of circular economy and adopting circular practices right at the onset? So, do you think that should happen, this more involvement of startups, etc.? And if yes, should the conglomerates facilitate that? And how would they do that?
Yeah, so I must say that symposiums is a good idea always and involving more people, but it's just one channel. When the corporate today is also permitted to put their CSR funds for innovations in academic institutions, I think that even could be an opportunity where they work with the academic institutions to help startups, to innovate in the space of circularity. And the third element is that we have to put the perspective on circular economy differently as we go to the tier three, as I told you, communities. So how do you build a green neighborhood, as an example? It doesn't use the word circular economy, but actually it means it. And then how do you have green academic campuses? Another way of communicating. So when we come to the third tier, we got to be, as I was saying earlier, less jargonistic. We have to be very simple and take the message. And I think that's a great potential for us to innovate there in terms of communication or launching campaigns.
Right, quite interesting, right? And I think that's a very novel view to go ahead and take, that instead of these symposiums, you should actually try and focus more and interact with more with the millennials, the Gen Z, and the tier three, who are and tier two and tier three, where the consumption patterns are also changing, and they need to be made aware, but in a language which is relatable.
So when we talk about actually going ahead and implementing any sort of a practice, any sort of a suggestion that agencies make to the government, what are some of the best in class practices that you would have seen given your extensive international experience with UNEP, ADB, the Sri Forum for UN Center in Japan? Because I think at the end of the day, implementation to the extent of implementation is what will define the extent of adoption. And having these practices to learn from, which have actually worked on the ground and might not have worked on the paper, or vice versa, I think would be very helpful. So it would be great if you could shed some light on that.
So one of the very powerful vehicles has been the sustainable public procurement, and many countries who have gone ahead there have performed very well to move towards circularity. So that's one thing which you find as a major shift. Examples here is countries like Japan, the countries like Korea, even country like Thailand. EU, of course, has a SPP policy in place in many countries of the European Union. So overall, this has been one instrument which has been found to be really good. In India, the Ministry of Finance has a sustainable Public Procurement Task Force, which I'm also a member, and we would see slowly a push coming from the Procurement Act itself, asking preference to environmentally sound products. There is also an effort done by UNEP to take this ahead in many countries, in transition and developing countries. In fact, UNEP asked me to work in a country like Mauritius, and I spent quite some time to build in the Ministry of Finance a sustainable public procurement system. And that has also, in many ways, in there are 14 such countries which took assistance from UNEP. So that's happening. The other example is in some countries, the circular economy is legislated like a law, and a country which was one of the first ones who moved, China, and then they enacted a law on circular economy as early as in 2007. So it has given mixed successes because you can't enforce circular economy. There has been also a good experience on use of economic instruments and economic instruments to promote more repair and refurbishing. That means extending the life of the product before it is reaching the stage of recycling. And these economic instruments have taken different forms and legislations as well. For example, there is something called Right to Repair Act, which is discussed, a lot in the United States. People saying that we have a right to repair, which is protested by those companies who are making those products, saying that repairing cannot be outsourced; it has to be done only by the company which has made those products. But these are very interesting examples where people have used procurement, people have used legislations, people have used economic instruments. Again, very good examples there is France. Leading example is also Singapore, where you see all these different instruments and frameworks being used very judiciously. So everything moves in phases. We are talking about now the term regional circular economy, that is going more in the planning stage itself. One of the countries which has got great experience to share is Scotland. And in Scotland, you see a concept of regional circular economy, which is not just discussed, but is being put in place already.
Got it, got it. So, is there any particular challenge that you would like to talk about while implementing these operational or capital incentives or tax-based incentives? Because it's all coming from the center, right? So what are the hindrances, given that you've been on the other side, what are the hindrances that you've seen or felt? If we are able to overcome those, we'll be able to cross the hump and be able to achieve our goals together and at a faster pace.
I think what I see is that the number of initiatives, good ones, happening, across the country in different sectors. And I think what we also recommended to Niti Ayog was having a agency to play the apex function of coordination and dissemination of information. That's something important. Right now, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has drafted a national policy on resource efficiency. That draft is already on the web, and I think that attempts to put things together where the MOEFCC is planning to play that kind of a coordinating role. So this is one part of it. And the second part of is that, as I said earlier, because we have a huge role of the informal sector, the material flows are difficult to estimate. And that is a big challenge, that we do not know how the materials are moving today. And this is important that there's a concept we use called circularity indicators or metrics. And countries like Japan, for example, publish every year the national circularity indicators, and they are able to communicate to people what have they achieved in terms of the recycling rates. Our challenge is because of the huge informal sector, we really need more research, more communication, more involvement to build these material flows, because only then we would know how effective have been our policies and incentive mechanisms and all kinds of capacity building efforts what we are talking about. resulting into a better circular performance. So I would put that second element. The first, which I said, is coordination, harmonization. But second important one is the estimation of material flows. And sometimes we call estimating the size of circular economy itself, and that becomes a challenge, especially as I said, because of the informal sector. So this is my high point, I would say, of the challenges which we are currently facing.
Right, quite insightful, right? Because we always get stuck at coordination and communication, and we always end up blaming the government or the corporates for not doing enough. But at the end of the day, uh, the informal sector is such a huge challenge that we haven't been able to crack it. And I think that's quite an insightful answer.
Very interesting, right? So maybe let's talk about the work that you're doing at EMC, because I think it'd be very important for us to understand that how you're able to pull off ENS due diligence to circular economy, right? A host of solutions covering the entire spectrum, and you have served firms like ITC, but have also served the government of Malaysia and so many others. So what would be the coolest project according to you that you've been able to implement? Because I mean, we get the details on the website, and it is really cool. But according to you, as a circular economy practitioner consultant, what is the coolest thing that you think you've undertaken?
Right. As a company active in this space for many years, before the term circular economy got attention, so to say, the earlier avatara was cleaner production. And cleaner production actually captures even today a lot what is said in the definition of circular economy. So we started working on the subject of cleaner production in the early 90s. In fact, we were involved very closely with the cleaner production program of United Nations and played a significant role in the first 10 years and prepared a global status report for cleaner production. And when we prepared the global status, we also got into preparing a compendium of resources for those who want to, now I would say, circularity, practice circularity. And that is something, a multimedia resource kit we prepared. It's called the Cleaner Production Companion. And, having done that kind of a work, our spread of activities did not limit only to India. We started working on cleaner production projects in Thailand and Vietnam and Malaysia, in the Philippines, and we also worked in Egypt for long. We still continue to work in Egypt, where we were associated with one of their anchor programs on promoting investments in industries for cleaner production. So, as we grew more and more conceptually towards circularity, our work in all our kinds of services we do started looking at two important aspects: resource efficiency, and I use the second important term, resource sufficiency. So, it's not enough that we are good at resource efficiency, we got to also look at sufficiency, which is in fact the consideration to sustainability. So we blended these two together whenever we talk about conducting due diligences. So we just don't look at whether the businesses are compliant to the law or the legislation, but how sensitive and prepared are they towards the local sustainability. And that is important to understand how resilient is the business. And then we decided that we focus more on that and bring in also the concepts, the reality of climate change. So all that put together, we found that you know going around providing, you can call this more like a 360 degrees service to the business and the investors. That became our forte. In fact, today we work a lot with the investors, guiding them whether their investments are going to be effective, not just to ensure the compliance, but how can the investment help the borrower to go beyond compliance. And when we talk about beyond compliance, we do address circularity. I think much less work has been done in practice on sustainable packaging, and so we got that opportunity to work with business houses, conducting with their packaging teams ideation workshops, These are structured workshop. We use a lot of life cycle assessment tools for packaging, and then help the companies through their teams. This is important because you got to really ensure that there's a ownership to those creative ideas from the company itself. And then using this LCA type of software, we help the company to do a rapid evaluation of the options of packaging, for example. And all of what I'm saying is also applicable to product design, not just to packaging. But I think this upstream thinking, I see that happening today in the business houses, and we hope to play a greater role there. And lastly, we are engaged, as I said, in the policy front, and engaging ourselves with the state and the central governments is another important area which we value a lot. We stay connected always with what the government is doing, not just in India, but also some of the countries which I mentioned that we are been working for quite some time. Now, in terms of the outreach, we set up a website called indiacirculareconomy.com, all one word, which is a free website. We have more than 250 people logged in there already, and we host there a lot of useful resources on circular economy. What we have is something unique. I run a WhatsApp group with about 130 experts on circular economy. We've been doing it now for a year, and all the discussions, and this is very important point, that all the discussions we do monthly distillation of what we discussed. And these discussions are thematic, and these distillations are placed for the general public who are not part of those 130 members. They can access that distillation on indiacirculareconomy.com. So that's something which we love to do. So we have very structured discussions happening on this subject, and these 130 members are not just from India. We have people from different countries in leadership positions, and they bring in updated content that gets discussed, then distillated, and then capsuled as a report and kept on this website. So this is something as a company we love to do, and we will continue doing such work.
Wow, that's an amazing answer, right? Because you're talking about touching each and every stakeholder in the entire circular economy ecosystem and providing a 360-degree service with compendiums, the resources, and in fact, reaching out to people on the ground through the websites and the resources that you've been able to compile. I think I would personally like to thank you a lot for taking this initiative for the last and leading it for the last few decades because this is something that we keep failing to realize, right? That even when this pandemic gets over, the economic crisis that we might be looking at gets over, the fight for our environment, the fight for our future, the fight for our future generations is something we'll have to continue on. And that's not easy, and that's definitely not going to get easier unless we mend our ways. And I think we have people like you to look up to for that. So thank you so much for that, Prasad. It's been an amazing time talking to you. Hey listeners, I really hope you enjoyed this podcast. Stay tuned for weekly episodes on Bending the Lines as we give you a circular lens of industries. Do follow InfinityBox and support us in the journey of a circular world. Until next time, this is your host, Shashwat Gangwal, signing off.